today, one of the thoughts that came to my mind is that the scripture passages today really deal with offering people hope. And if you look at the news lately, we really live in a world right now that seems to be covered in darkness and needs words of hope and inspiration. We live in a world that is wrought with war, fighting, anger, distrust, people who feel that they have been forsaken and forgotten. And here we are as Christians with words from God, and we are called to proclaim them, yet we are sometimes too timid, too frightened. First of all, I'd like us to start by looking at Isaiah. We have these words from God here spoken with hope to a people who have no hope. They are a people who have been torn away from their place, their land. They've been scattered to places they do not know. They are foreigners once more. God is calling them back together as a people, and those who have compassion for them, for the people who are scattered that God wants to bring back together, they are the ones who will lead them back. These words of hope were given to people who are imprisoned, living in darkness, which in the Bible, if you read that word, has multiple different ways of being translated. In darkness, but it also means forsaken, lost, forgotten, despairing. Calling the people who are in darkness back into light, he's calling the hungry and the thirsty. Each is a reference to the very people that we as Christians are called to serve. God reminds all people in this passage that he cannot and will not forget us. And this is the part that I love the best. Each of us was created in the image of God. Each of us is seen as a child of God. Yet how many of you in your times have felt totally alone? Have felt that at one time or another you've been forsaken, and you're not sure where to turn next. God says that it is impossible for him to forget us. Why? Well, he uses a reference. Those of you who are mothers probably understand this better than others. But how many of you mothers could possibly have forgotten your child? Kind of difficult thing to do. You might have wanted to at one time or another. You might have wanted to send them away once in a while. But the reality is you could not forget them. Yet there are women in this world, there are fathers in this world who have forgotten their children. It's a terrible thing to say, but it's true. And God tells us he cannot and will not forget his children because he has written them on the palm of his hand. I want to look at that word written a little bit more. In the NRSV, it actually translates that word as inscribed. Another way of putting it is we are tattooed on the hands of God. Now, if you think about a tattoo, how easy is that to remove? It's kind of there permanently, isn't it? Even if they do the treatments or whatever to destroy it and break it up, there's still residue that's left. It's never 100% gone. It's still there. God is saying that we are more like a tattoo on the palm of his hands. He cannot forget us because, let's face it, folks, when you go somewhere, do these go along with you? Unless you are unfortunate enough to have lost it somehow, these usually go wherever you go. So wherever God is, he cannot forget us because we are always with him. Talk about words of hope to a people who feel that they have been forgotten, lost, trampled on, that are hungry and thirsty, who are unknowing of where to go next. God is saying, I don't forget you. One of the other scriptures that we have for this morning comes from 1 Corinthians, and Paul is still writing along the same lines of what it means to have hope, and he's talking about he knows that he is in the presence of God. He knows that God has him. He knows to whom he belongs and where he is going, and because of that, he doesn't care what anyone else thinks about him. Now, let's face it, folks, we live in a society where image and your Status has importance, doesn't it? In Paul's day, he lived in a society where it was honor and shame. You either had honor or you had shame. You either gained honor or you lost honor and became shamed. There wasn't anything in between. And you gained honor by war. You gained honor by winning dialogues, conversations, and fights. You won honor by being superior to someone. You won honor, and you were constantly looking for ways to get more honor, because the more honor you had, the higher status you gained in the community. Paul is saying that Jesus is a little bit different from that. He's not interested. But I want us to rethink about this concept of honor. We still live in it. How many of you remember high school? How many of you would rather forget high school? There we go. The reality is high school is still on that honor-shame basis. We might not look at it in that way, but it really is. You gain honor by putting others down so that you look better. You play sports so that you get better prestige. You gain or you join this group or that group so that you are appearing better before your peers. You gain honor that way. And if you somehow lose that status, it takes a while to get it back, doesn't it? Let's move it outside of high school into the real world. We change that from honor and shame to how much do you have versus how much you should have to look good. We live in a day where it's all about what you have. It's about your possessions. Are you better than the Joneses? Or are you at least keeping up with them? Now, those of you who might be Joneses, I'm not using you as a reference. I'm using that as the generic term. But the reality is we live in a day and age where it's all about what you have. Think about it for a moment. How many of you have bought stuff simply because you thought you should have it? How many of those items are oftentimes still in the package that you bought them in? And for the really bad circumstances, how many of them are still in the bag that you brought them home in? I've got some folks who are laughing out there, so obviously that does happen. How many of you have stuff? How many of you have a lot of stuff? Now, let's really get to the nitty-gritty. How many of you have stuff that's in boxes that you haven't opened in years? I do. Has it made you a better person having all that stuff?
Just the opposite.
Just the opposite. So if possessions aren't what it is that defines who we are and what makes us the kind of person we're supposed to be, what does? Paul, in writing what he does, talking out of the concept of honor and shame, today maybe we would talk about possessions that we gain or possessions that we lost. Paul says that it is not to be held in high esteem by what the world expects. We are to be held in high esteem by what God expects. He goes on to talk about how everything that we own, everything within the world, isn't ours, it's God's. But God, through his desire to provide for us, has given everything over into our control. He goes on to say that how we use what we've been given for the benefit of God's purposes is the way we're supposed to be looking at the world. It's not what you have, it's what you do with what you have. Paul reminds us also that it's not our place to judge how people are using what they have. He reminds us that we aren't the ones who can judge the effectiveness of others. We are called to hold one another accountable. How are you using the gifts and graces that you have for the purposes of God? That is holding one another accountable. So the question that he's putting before us is, Cheryl, how are you using your gifts? Are you using them to benefit God? Phyllis, are you using your gifts to benefit God? Herb, are you using your gifts to benefit God? Ultimately, the final judgment of whether or not we have been good stewards, good and faithful servants, isn't with us, it's with God. After all, most of us would like to hear those words when we enter into the presence of our Father, well done, good and faithful servant. a certain quality? Is their appearance what we would consider that of an accomplished person? Do they speak in a manner of being educated and respected? Are their actions what we would consider appropriate? Then we pass judgment as to whether a person is worthy or not of being involved with us in life, in worship, in play. So let's take a moment and take what Paul is saying and throw it back into Isaiah. If we are the people who are called to have compassion on the ones who are scattered, who have no hope, we cannot be judging how they come out of darkness. We cannot judge how they have become hungry, or why they have become thirsty, or why they became scattered. That's not ours to do. Ours is to bring them back into the presence of God, and God will take care of the rest. We are to bring them beside the still waters. We're supposed to bring them to the places of pasture where they can feed, where they can be taken care of. And then we've got Jesus with his words in Matthew. We are reminded that the meaning that is gleaned from our lives does not come, or does come, from what is outside us. It comes from what's within our heart, but it comes with what we do. In other words, what we do with our lives, what we give of our lives over to others and over to the purposes of God will determine what kind of a person we are. In a society that places so much value on possessions of things, we are in constant danger of falling into the trap of our society of serving the acquisition of wealth and property to the detriment of gaining wealth in heaven. This passage deals with where our hope comes from. This passage deals with who we are. It deals with what it means to be anxious. What we want and how we value ourselves is spoken about here. Do not pass judgment on yourself for what you do not have. Do not pass judgment on others for what they do or do not have. But rather, understand that the gathering of possessions does not determine your value in the presence of God. What you have done with that does. Don't worry about the anxieties of tomorrow. I listened to this and I'm reminded of a gentleman that I grew up knowing. He and his wife were good friends of my family for 5 generations. And one of his words of wisdom that he imparted went like this: I have spent my health to gain my wealth. Now I spend my wealth to try and gain my health. But then he went on to add another little thing at other times, and he said, there are times I wish I had spent more of my life on and with